Today on Young Heretics, I'd like to make the case for why saving the Republic requires you to turn off your damn phone. Look, bro, I want to help you upgrade your kitchen and honestly your whole life. And to do that, you need public goods. The thing about a lot of basics that you get from the grocery store is, first of all, they've got all kinds of weird, gross chemicals in them. They can have all sorts of weird adverse effects on, people's hormonal balance and whatever. Like there's just gunk in a lot of name brand stuff or stuff you get at the grocery store. Plus, it doesn't look very good. Like you have your sink and it's all clogged up with like natty, gross blue soaps and sponges and whatever. Public goods fixes both of those problems. They have super clean, streamlined aesthetics to everything that they do, and it's all made with excellent high quality ingredients. If you're interested in your health, and you should be, Public Goods is the place to go that you can trust. Everything from coffee to toilet paper, shampoo, pet food. I really like their snacks a lot. They have these chocolate covered almonds that I just can't get enough of. And they have an excellent deal for my listeners. When you go to publicgoods.com/heretics, that's publicgoods.com/heretics, you get $15 off your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase. That's publicgoods.com/heretics to get $15 off your first order, $15 of free stuff at publicgoods.com/heretics. Okay, I'm being a little facetious, but only the littlest tiny bits. Now, you guys, I think, generally know my attitude about technology. I'm not a techno pessimist. I think that there is such a thing as there's going to be such a thing as digital technology. And I think that it is possible for us to use it to virtuous ends. But I was talking last week a little bit about some of the practicality of Plato's description of how the republic, the perfect state, can decay into more and more degraded forms of regimes. And one of the great things about it is that it links the regime to the soul of the individual, or the soul of at least the people who are in charge, right? And these little forms of corruption away from the good, right? Because the question, what is the soul, has everything to do with the question, what is the highest good? And what is your highest good determines, right, what you're actually going to do, and also what you are supposed to be doing, right? And so as people take lower and lower things for the good, the ruling part of the soul becomes more and more degraded. Some, those who love the good are really working from their logos, from their reason, from the highest and most divine part of their soul. Those who only love honor, right, are sort of starting to decay into more sort of spirited, thumotic form of life, right? They're letting their thumos lead because they want that honor and the courage. They want to, Plato says they're going to go to war a little bit too much, right? They're going to be too eager for battle. And then eventually you just go to money because money allows you to satisfy your desires. And this will eventually lead first to oligarchic incrustation, right, to the hardening of an oligarchy, and then to a people's uprising, which establishes a kind of chaos of different ways of life, because that's the true appetitive part of the soul, which just wants, today it wants food, tomorrow it wants sex, it just wants everything at once. And eventually later on in this book, book 9, we're going to get it compared to a many-headed monster, right, which just thrashes around. And so let me just do a little cleanup from the end of book 8 now, because what's going to happen is we're going to lead from the democratic, which is really the mob society, right, that Plato is talking about. He's not really talking here about democracy as any old form of government where the people have authority, but he's really talking about the pure democracy that was kind of decayed Athens, right? And so he says that's what comes next after oligarchy, and then you get the advent of a tyrant. And how and why does that come about? Well, first of all, excess freedom leads to excess tyranny. This is a great observation, still relevant for us, right? Yes, of course, liberty is one of the goods with which we are endowed by our creator, right? We are endowed by our creator with a right to liberty. And so in this country, we have a strong emphasis, right, on keeping the state from infringing upon liberty, or even better, empowering the state to protect liberties, right? Liberty rightly understood, liberty the freedom of religion, not having to worship in any one sect, right? And yet, right, we don't believe in absolute liberty. We believe some liberties are actually wrong, like that you can't have the liberty to murder somebody. And why is that? Well, because liberty is one among a number of absolute goods, and it's constrained by the others, which include, right, which include moral questions, right? Questions of, well, I can't actually do moral harm to somebody, immoral harm, I guess I should say, to somebody, right? Using my liberty. And, these questions become kind of delicate, and they have been sort of misused by our leftist elites, right? To say, well, harm is anything bad, like you make me feel bad, that's harm, right? No, there are actual moral absolutes at stake in murder, right? That are not at stake in just making somebody feel bad. And so balancing these goods, which are themselves goods, but which also, impinge upon one another, is part of our job as Americans, part of the point of the Constitution, part of the point of our state, and so on and so forth. But Plato is talking about an excess of liberty where everything is permissible, right? And the reason this leads to an excess of tyranny is really fascinating. So let me read actually first to you from this is the development of the tyrannical man. And it's gonna turn out that the tyrant, the tyrannical man, or the man of a tyrannical soul, is actually the most enslaved. And he's enslaved because he's enslaved to his passions, to his appetitive soul. And this is the culmination of that argument about ruling, right? That if your logos is ruling, then you're actually free, because your logos is in some sense the highest form of you, right? And everything else finds its freedom in submission to your reason. But if you're just able to indulge your every appetite, then you actually don't have the ability to reason freely. You just have to talk yourself into fulfilling whatever appetite you have. So true freedom, right, includes freedom from appetites, mastery over self. And that's why tyranny, being a tyrannical person, is a form of slavery. And that the sort of advent of that slavery into the excess of freedom is what we're dealing with here at the end of Book 8 and the beginning of Book 9. So let's get into it. You probably have way more tension than you think you do, and Theragun can help with this. It doesn't matter if you're an elite athlete or a laptop jockey. You can be sitting at home all day, and even that hunching over your computer, it adds up, man. And, you don't realize until you start using Theragun how much it can help. It gets to the source of the pain by releasing tension using Theragun's signature percussive therapy, which goes 60% deeper than vibration alone. Whether you want to treat your muscle tension from working out, an injury, or just the stresses of everyday life, there is no substitute for the Theragun Gen 4. They are trusted by 250 professional sports teams like Real Madrid and elite athletes like Paul George, DeAndre Hopkins, Maria Sharapova, hundreds of thousands of customers, and me. And if you think about it, I'm a lot like Maria Sharapova in a whole bunch of ways. We're both icons. No, I'm just kidding. Nothing like Maria Sharapova, but I do love Theragun, and it's very, very helpful no matter what you are doing and how you are working out. Try Theragun for 30 days, starting at only $199 when you go to therabody.com/heretics right now to get your Gen 4 Theragun today. That's therabody.com/heretics, therabody.com/heretics. So here we are, we're in the democratic city, which is the mob city, right? He says, I suppose, this is Socrates talking here, I suppose that when a democratic city, once it's thirsted for freedom, gets bad wine bearers as its leaders and gets more drunk than it should on this unmixed draft, then, unless the rulers are very gentle and provide a great deal of freedom, it punishes them, charging them with being polluted and oligarchs. Yes, he said, that's what they do. And this is Adeimantus now talking. And it spatters, says Socrates, with mud those who are obedient, alleging that they are willing slaves of the rulers and nothings. I said, while it praises and honors, both in private and public, the rulers who are like the ruled, and the ruled who are like the rulers. Isn't it necessary in such a city that freedom spread to everything? So he says, if freedom, liberty, construed as just ability to do what you want, right? No constraints. If that's your only good, then other virtues, other goods are going to fall by the wayside, including the virtue of obedience to the law and the virtue of law in and of itself, right? And so, my friend, I said, for it to filter down to the very private houses and end up by anarchies being planted in the very beasts. A father habituates himself to be like his child and fear his sons, and a son habituates himself to be like his father and to have no shame or fear of his parents, so that he may be free and metic is on equal level with townsman, and townsman with metic, and similar with the foreigner. This is part of Aristophanes' clouds also, right? The kind of the son who ends up beating up his father. These and other small things of the following kind come to pass, I said, as the teacher in such a situation is frightened of the pupils and fawns on them. So the students make light of their teachers as well as of their attendants, and generally the young copy their elders and compete with them in speeches and deeds, while the old come down to the level of the young, imitating the young. They're overflowing with facility and charm, and that's so they won't seem to be unpleasant or despotic. Does this sound to you like a classroom you've ever been in? Because it sure does to me. And the ultimate in the freedom of the multitude, my friend, occurs in such a city when the purchased slaves, male and female, are no less free than those who have bought them. And we almost forgot to mention the extent of the law of equality and freedom in the relations of women with men and men with women. So some of these things, right, we would say, of course, that the end of slavery is a good thing, but we're going to totally miss the point if we just shake our finger at Plato and say, it's you think that slaves should be obedient. No. He's actually saying something much more structural, which is that there are, whatever city you live in is going to have rules, right, order and stability based on people's buy-in to the rules of life. And once those become inherently evil, once all rule, all constraint becomes evil, right, then you're living in the truly democratic, which is to say the truly freedom-obsessed state. Freedom even over the notion of a law, right? Any law, any imposition, any constraint on my ability. You see where this is going, right? Like you say that I can't be a man even though I am a woman. You say that I can't be like, you say that I can't have total control over my every aspect of my sex life. You're telling me that I can't sleep with 15 people in a night and not get monkeypox? You're telling me that I can't have unprotected sex and just not get pregnant, right? You're telling me all of these kind of like constraintless ideas. It's like, well, I'm not telling you that. Like, that's just a fact of life. But the hatred of all constraint, right, is the excess of freedom that Plato is talking about here. So how is it that this leads to tyranny? Well, it turns out that in such a situation, right, you're going to have ambitious people, because you always have ambitious people. And one of the things we've talked a lot about on the show is like you have to have a place for ambitious people to do good to the state. And if you don't have that place, then instead you have what he calls the transformation from leader to tyrant. Is when a leader begins to act out the tale that is told in connection with the temple of Lycaean Zeus in Arcadia. What's that? Asks Adeimantus, and we may well ask the same, right? He says that the man who tastes of the single morsel of human inwards, cut up with those of other sacrificial victims, must necessarily become a wolf. Isn't it also the same for the leader of a people who, taking over a particularly obedient mob, does not hold back from shedding the blood of his tribe unjustly, but brings, or rather, shedding the blood of his tribe, but unjustly brings charges against a man, which is exactly what they usually do, and bringing him before the court murders him, and doing away with a man's life, tastes of kindred blood with unholy tongue and mouth, and banishes, and kills, and hints at cancellations of debts and redistributions of land? Isn't it also necessarily fated, I say, that after this, such a man either be slain by his enemies or be tyrant and turn from a human being into a wolf? And a sort of governing feature of this account of things is that people, the Machiavellian thing, right? People who have power become paranoid about retaining it. And so you get purges, right? And it's interesting how closely this describes the proscriptions under Sulla, right? Which hadn't happened yet. But when we talk about the breakdown of the Roman Republic, we see a lot of this going on in the tyrants who begin to take control, that they become paranoid because they know that they are one against an entire city. How does it happen? Well, you get somebody in charge, right, who is just as lawless as the civilization has become, right? Because if if pure democracy is against all restraint, right, then the people who are most successful in that society are going to be the people who are totally cunning and willing to sacrifice everything because they have no moral restraints. And so they will just let go to get what they want and to hold on to power. He says, once you begin that, once you get a taste of that, this is why when we talked about Washington, right, I was so impressed with his refusal even to countenance the suggestion of a crown, right? He was like, even talking to me about kingship is bad, right? Keep that away from me because he believed in the power of moral stain, right? And so this idea that once you taste a certain piece of human flesh, you become a wolf, right? Is how you get the tyrant. And eventually we descend into this amazing kind of like proto-Macbeth thing where you have to purge all your enemies. You're a man alone in the high castle, and you're just like constantly on the watch for evil. And so this is what brings us into book 9, which is really the kind of book about tyranny. And it's about tyranny of the state and tyranny of the soul. So the first thing that we get actually is a little bit of good life advice, which is protecting yourself against tyranny of the soul. And I've touched on this a bit, but this is why I began by saying, turn off your damn phone, right? Let me read to you from the prescription that Socrates gives for how to avoid, just like Washington, right? How to keep your soul pure of this thing inside you, right, that is wanting to be ruled by your momentary desires. Because before you talk about politics at all, you got to be talking about your own soul, right? So here's what Socrates says. So he makes a distinction between necessary and unnecessary pleasures and desires. So like you have to eat, right? That's a necessary pleasure, right? But he says, of those unnecessary pleasures, there are, in my opinion, some that are hostile to law and probably come to be in everyone, but when checked by the laws and the better desires with the help of argument, in some human beings are entirely gotten rid of, or only a few weak ones are left, while in others, stronger and more numerous ones remain. And those stronger ones are the ones that wake up in sleep when the rest of the soul, all that belongs to the calculating, tame, and ruling part of it, slumbers, while the beastly and wild part, gorged with food or drink, is skittish and putting sleep away, seeks to go and satisfy its dispositions. You know that in such a state, it dares to do everything as though it were released from and rid of all shame and prudence. And it doesn't shrink from attempting intercourse as it supposes with a mother or with anyone else. He's talking about dreams, right? He says dreams are kind of our unfettered, what Freud would call the id, right? They are this just indicator that deep down within us, there is still this many-headed beast kind of thrashing about. And no matter how civilized we've become, in sleep, we realize that there is still the part of us, right? That even though we train ourselves out of acting on this, like we always have to be vigilant against these desires. He says, I can suppose a man who has a healthy and moderate relationship to himself and who goes to sleep only after he does the following. First, he awakens his calculating part and feasts it on fair arguments and considerations, coming to an understanding with himself. Second, he feeds the desiring part in such a way that it is neither in want nor surfeited, in order that it will rest and not disturb the best part by its joy or its pain, but rather leave the best part alone, pure and by itself, to consider and to long for the perception of something that it doesn't know, either something that has been or is going to be. And third, he soothes the spirited part in the same way and does not fall asleep with his spirit aroused, because there are some he got angry at. So don't rage tweet before bed, guys. I'm speaking to myself here too, right? No, this is actually really still just excellent advice. You have 3 parts of your soul. You have a reason, you have your like courage or your anger, your thumos, your sort of manly passions. Even if you're a woman, you still have thumos. And then you have your appetites and your desires. And he says, satisfy your desires. Don't starve yourself of satisfaction, but don't overindulge either. Pursue a moderate course so that then they're not, inflamed basically when you go to bed. Like don't eat 2 pizzas right at midnight before bed. Calm your anger, right? Don't go to bed angry, right? Classic, let not the sun set on your anger, kind of classic advice from the Bible, from Paul. And then stimulate your rational part, right? Then find some food for your rational part. Reflect upon your day, pray to God, talk to God about your day, and read something, right? Something that is not going to inflame the other parts of your soul, but read something, read the Bible, read a work of theology, read a work of philosophy, right? 30 minutes of this before bed, right, is actually an amazing cure. And it sounds so homespun because it is, right? It is Plato recognizing that out of these tiny beginnings, right, out of the virtue or the vice of the soul, the order or the disorder of the soul, come all the catastrophes to which the state is heir. And so having given that advice, he's now going to talk about how it is that this breaks down, right? How the tyrant loses that control over himself, in part because of the democratic chaos in which he lives. But here's what he says next. He says, so he's talking here, right, about a son with kind of a young man with a lot of potential, basically, right? What happens if that person grows up in a democratic society? He says, well, the dread enchanters and tyrant makers and his other, and other people that want to basically use him for their own ends, right, are fighting against his father and his relatives who are trying to steer him toward the good, right? And he said, when they have no hope of getting hold of the young man in any other way, this is the tyrant makers, right? They contrive to implant some love in him, a great winged drone. Remember, talking about the desire that just pushes you towards something even when you know it's bad or when you know that it's not your best thing, right? To be the leader of the idle desires that insist on all available resources being distributed to them. Or do you suppose that love in such men is anything other than a winged drone? And Adeimantus says, I suppose that it is nothing but this. Then, when the other desires, overflowing with incense, myrrh, crowns, wines, and all the pleasures with which such societies are rife, buzz about the drone, making it grow great and fostering it, they plant the sting of longing in it. Now this leader of the soul takes madness for its armed guard and is stung to frenzy. And if it finds in the man any opinions or desires accounted good and still admitting of shame, it slays them and pushes them out of him until it purges him of moderation and fills him with madness brought in from abroad. Your account, he said, of a tyrannic man's genesis is quite perfect. It is for this reason, too, I said, that love has from of old been called a tyrant. Love, right? The desire, this time probably talking about like actual romantic desire, right? Is a tyrant because it's the one desire to which you submit all other things. When you're thinking with the wrong organ, right? You will do anything. You'll ruin all the other parts of your life in service of this tyrant, right? It doesn't a drunken man also have something of a tyrannic turn of mind? And further, the man who is mad and deranged undertakes and expects to be able to rule not only over human beings, but gods too. And you demonic man, I said, a man becomes tyrannic in the precise sense when either by nature or by his practices or both, he has become drunken, erotic, or melancholic. You're saying tyranny of the soul, right, is a kind of self-subjugation. It's not that you think of the king as the guy that can do anything he wants, right? But the king is actually, the tyrant is actually the greatest slave. And you, of course, see tyrannic subjects, just as you see tyrannic people. In a moment, we're going to talk about the distinction between being a tyrant in soul and being an actual tyrant in the state, because that's a distinction that Socrates makes, right? But he says the core thing, the true disaster, and this is all by way of proving, of course, right, that it sucks to be a tyrant, right? It's better to be a just man, but like, when you are a tyrant, you are basically a slave to the many-headed beast. You are just subjugated to and then once the people that want you for their own gain, for their own interest, the people that want you to be a tyrant, install some desire in you, the desire of lust, right? The desire of pleasure or whatever. And once you get into that position, you're the loneliest man in the world. You're Macbeth. You're basically sitting, with no friends, because the only people who are near you are the people who want proximity to your power, who want to ride to power on your coattails, and you are now malformed in soul, and you rule the state that way as well. But it's kind of subsidiary. That's less the point, right? Citizens who have been trained into tyranny, right, are citizens who are slaves to their passions. And this is why when you see people screaming incoherently outside the Supreme Court, you are looking at exactly what the ruling class wants. It wants people who have no reasoning faculties that are strong enough to bring their desires and their passions into control and under control. That's the tyrannic subject. It's not just the people who are doing tyranny in the state who count as tyrannical. There is also such a thing as the tyrannical soul, which is the slave to the passions, right? Not a actual slave in physical chains, but in a deeper sense, the slave to the passions. So this is tyranny. This is Plato's account of tyranny. It's extremely powerful and gives a much fuller account. Now let's talk about kind of something, interesting little detours, and we haven't talked about. How is it that he knew all of this? And there is actually a biographical answer to that question as well as a philosophical one. There's probably nothing more important in running a business than good people. And to get good people, you need Indeed. Hiring is really tough. Sorting through resumes, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. It can be an endless process. And it's not really the best use of your time if you're the boss, if you're running the business, right? You want to see the cream of the crop. And Indeed is really helpful with that and all sorts of other parts of the hiring process. They are the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Super smooth and streamlined to be using one service for it. We use it at Soundfront. And let me tell you, our people are the best. They're the best people. We have the best people here at Soundfront. No, really, actually, we do have the best people. And Indeed helps us to find the best people. You can start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/Heretics. Heretics. That's a special link just for my listeners, because I know that a lot of you out there are hiring. It's a time when a lot of people are hiring, and my listeners, I think, skewed toward the small business owners, and that's excellent. So I want you to have everything you need to do that. Go to Indeed.com/heretics to claim your $75 job credit. Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So I've dwelled a lot in this podcast, especially in our Plato episodes, on the bitter disillusionment and resentment that Plato must have experienced upon watching Socrates' trial and eventual execution, right? And I've dwelt on it because I think we can forget a lot of times. We think of these giants of philosophy as kind of untouchable, perfect greats, and their works just emerge in thin air, right, as these totemic items, and it's like we take the truth from them, and but in fact, right, so much of this, even truths that are absolute and ultimate, right, are nevertheless linked to people's biography, and people's life gives them insight into certain things, right? And in that way, it can really help to get to know an author. I mean, something I think that is like so often overlooked, but also so profound, is like, so Jesus, right? Jesus, the man who is the incarnation of God, but also is living a life in time, pronounces this prohibition on divorce, except in cases of sexual immorality, right? He says, thou shalt not, Moses gave you the writ of divorce to keep from, to cater to your hardened hearts. But, in the beginning, man left his family, man left his family and went with woman, and therefore, like, what God has joined, let no man separate. Right? So he says, so no divorce. So don't divorce. What God has joined, let no man separate, except in cases of sexual immorality. It's like, so that's obviously true because it's coming from the mouth of God. But that fact sometimes makes us forget that the person uttering it is a real person with a history who was almost rendered dispossessed and fatherless by divorce, right? Because when Mary became suddenly magically pregnant before she had actually married Joseph, right? Joseph was planning to put her away in silence, right? He was planning to quietly dismiss her. He was a good and honest man, says the text, but he thought, well, I can't marry this woman who's compromised. And then he was told by an angel, actually, you should get married, right? And so the fact that Joseph didn't break off, chose to trust God and not to break off that engagement, and not to do the putting away, not to do the sort of proto-divorce action, is why Jesus had a family and why he, had a father. An earthly father, that is, let's say a foster father, I guess. And this cannot but help but have had a profound effect on. I mean, when people talk about, how my mother chose not to abort me, and therefore I have this passionate sense that abortion, right, is wrong. It's like abortion would be wrong whether that person existed or not. But the power of that insight comes from that person's experience. It comes from their lived experience, which is a phrase that has been terribly bastardized, but is a core component of how we gain our human insights into the world. So this is all a way of introduction to what I'm about to say about Plato's life. But like, think about this, right? Like Jesus is pronouncing these godly prohibitions against divorce, and they're coming out of the real life history, which tells you something about how God works, right? That the facts and the chances of your life, if they become sources of insight for you, right? The insight is true, but the chances and the facts of your life are the delivery mechanism. They're how the insight comes to you, and they are not to be sniffed at or disregarded. That's why history is important. That's why your life is important, right? Even if you've had a painful life, even if terribly difficult things have come to you, it's like those things too may have been vehicles for insight. So, and Jesus is talking about pain and trauma in his family history. He's talking about, I would have been disowned essentially, if not for the bond of marriage that was preserved between my mother and my father. So, and so his prohibitions on divorce, again, would be true whether that was the case or not, but they come from a certain place. Plato's insights into tyranny also come from somewhere. And in part, they come from the tyranny of the 30, right? Because remember that after Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, Sparta installed this oligarchic regime, this brutal oligarchic regime that was eventually overthrown, but which during the reign, right, was incredibly murderous and suspicious, and it also implicated Socrates, because Socrates says in Plato's Apology that he had no part in the murders and the state persecutions, but one of his students was in the 30. And he sort of was tainted by association with them, and so Plato is bitterly disillusioned and sorrowful about the nature of oligarchy in this book 8 and sort of book 8 and 9 transition. But he is also reflecting upon the decay of democracy as well. So you see that these things he'd had personal experience of all of these things. And then after this, we are told in the biographical sources that he went to Sicily. Much like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, he had a little interlude where he went to Sicily. This is, if you haven't watched that movie lately, there's like a long period where Michael Corleone is in Sicily, and it's sort of like a little movie within a movie. And that's kind of like Plato's life. It's a little movie within a movie of Plato's life. We have a lot of biographical accounts of Plato from various different sources. It's very, very difficult with ancient biography to tell what is true and what is sort of embellishment designed to explain certain people's attitudes. But it seems relatively certain that he did, in fact, make this trip to Sicily, because everybody talks about it. And Sicily was an interesting place in the Greek world because there were these Greek colonies on it, which had basically just never done the democracy thing. And so they kind of became this like time capsule of tyranny. You remember that, of course, Athens had been through a period of tyranny under the Pisistratids, of monarchic or even autocratic, you might say, rule. And in Sicily, there had been a long tradition of Greek-speaking people from other parts of the Greek-speaking world going over to Sicily and experiencing the king's court. And it was both a kind of prelude and a prediction of what was to come, because monarchy would then become the kind of main force in the Hellenistic era as well. But so, just to give an example, a lot of the victory odes, right, the epinikia, or the epinikia, depending on how you want to pronounce it, of Pindar, are written for the tyrants of Sicily and Syracuse. Hero the First is one big one. But by the time of Plato, right, when he goes, he is going to the court of Dionysius. And Diogenes Laertius, our old friend, kind of tells the story nicely. He says he made 3 voyages to Sicily, the first time to see the island and the craters of Etna. On this occasion, this is Plato is voyaging, right, says Dionysius. On this occasion, Dionysius, the son of Hermocrates, being on the throne, forced him to become intimate with him. But when Plato held forth on tyranny and maintained the interest of the ruler alone was not the best end, unless he were also preeminent in virtue, he offended Dionysius, who in his anger exclaimed, "You talk like an old dotard, and you talk like a tyrant," rejoined Plato. And at this the tyrant grew furious, and at first was bent on putting him to death. Then, when he had been dissuaded from this by Dion and Aristomenes, he did not indeed go so far, but handed him over to Paulus the Lacedaemonian, who had just then arrived on embassy with orders to sell him into slavery. And so this is the kind of discursus, the little detour in Plato's life. And you can see, I think, this is just my hunch, although I think I'm right, you can sort of see Diogenes Laertius putting some of Plato's views from the Republic into his mouth at this time. And in reality, it's kind of more likely to be the other way around, right? That the interest of the ruler alone is not the best end. I mean, Plato is probably thinking through some of these ideas, and he's in the court of this tyrant, and he's suggesting that maybe just like you satisfying your own personal desires is not the point of ruling, right? Which will eventually become the kickoff insight of the Republic. And so it's unclear how much of this would have been developed before this experience, but he had at least proof of this insight in this very experience of being sold into slavery. Eventually escaped, was ransomed, saved by his friends. But this is, he had sort of firsthand direct experience of how all of this stuff works. And then the second time, he says, visiting the younger Dionysius, requesting of him lands and settlers for the realization of his republic. This is a really interesting little tidbit that Plato, we're told, actually tried to set up the Callipolis. And again, unclear whether that's actually something he did, but Dionysius, the younger Dionysius, promised them but did not keep his word. Some say that Plato was also in great danger, being suspected of encouraging Dion and Theodotus in a scheme for liberating the whole island. On this occasion, Archytas the Pythagorean wrote to Dionysius, procured his pardon, and got him conveyed safe to Athens. So we have these sort of records of Plato's various journeys. The third time he came to reconcile Dion and Dionysius, but failing to do so, returned to his own country without achieving anything. Now, Dion, this sort of intimate of Plato, is eventually assassinated. And this is the occasion for yet another source with a kind of questionable pedigree, and that is Plato's Epistle number 7. We haven't talked about Plato's letters, but there are letters of Plato, which we have in manuscript form, not Plato's own autograph, not his manuscript, but we have in manuscripts, we have these epistles, and they have been called under all sorts of question, whether they are legitimate or not. This is one of the ones that is perhaps more likely to be legitimate because it seems like an open letter. That is, it's written to the associates and companions of Dion. So Dion is assassinated 353 BC, and this letter is addressed to his followers, to his associates, and it is a sort of treatise upon some of the same themes as in the Republic. So on the one hand, you could say, well, that's because somebody knew what Plato thought, and so they had basically like fudged this letter that he was writing. On the other hand, maybe he was just working out these ideas and doing so in the political controversies of the day. So let me just read you a portion of this Epistle 7 because it speaks again to the portrait of the tyrant that we get in Book 9 of the Republic. He says, "In the days of my youth, my experience was the same as that of many others. I thought that as soon as I should become my own master, I would immediately enter into public life. But it so happened, I found, that the following changes occurred in the political situation. In the government then existing, reviled as it was by many, a revolution took place, and the revolution was headed by 51 leaders, of whom 11 were in the city and 10 in the Piraeus. Each of these sections dealing with the market and with all municipal matters requiring management, and 30 were established as irresponsible rulers of all." Here's the 30 tyrants, right? This is, Sparta obviously has a big hand in all of this, but also Plato says there's discontent in Athens as well. Now, some of these, some were actually connections and acquaintances of mine, and indeed they invited me at once to join their administration. So remember that Plato, who's Socrates' student, is also kind of moving about in these circles that are going to become also wrapped up in the 30, right? So some of these were actually connections of mine, and they invited me to join their administration, thinking it would be congenial. So this is really, Socrates, if this is authentic, Plato is saying that he was invited to be one of the 30. The feelings I then experienced, owing to my youth, were in no way surprising, for I imagined that they would administer the state by leading it out of an unjust way of life into a just way, and consequently, I gave my mind to them very diligently to see what they would do. He's saying, can you harness the power of an oligarchy for the good? Can you turn it from the inside, working from the inside? Can you reform it? And indeed, I saw how these men, within a short time, caused men to look back on the former government as a golden age. He's saying, well, we didn't love the pre-oligarchic government, but we're better than this, right? Caused men to look back on the former government as a golden age, and above all, how they treated my aged friend Socrates, whom I would hardly scruple to call the most just of men then living, when they tried to send him along with others after one of the citizens to fetch him by force, that he might be put to death. This is the thing in the Apology that Socrates says he refused to do, right? And so you can see the connections here. Either Plato himself or somebody that's read Plato very carefully is sort of saying this was this moment, right? And I was appalled that they asked Socrates to do this. Their object being that Socrates, whether he wished or no, might be made to share in their political action. So this was their attempt to implicate Socrates in their tyranny, right? Or in their oligarchy, I guess. He, however, refused to obey and risked the uttermost penalties rather than be a partaker in their unholy deeds. So when I beheld all these actions and others of a similar grave kind, I was indignant, and I withdrew myself from the evil practices then going on. But in no long time, the power of the 30 was overthrown, together with the whole of the government which then existed. Then, once again, I was really, though less urgently, impelled with the desire to take part in public and political affairs. Many deplorable events, however, were still happening in those times, troublous as they were, and it was not surprising that in some instances during these revolutions, men were avenging themselves on their foes too fiercely, yet, notwithstanding, the exiles who then returned exercised no little moderation. This was exiles, by the way, who went to Thebes and then came back to kind of overthrow the 30. But as ill luck would have it, certain men of authority summoned our comrade Socrates before the law courts, laying a charge against him which was most unholy, and which Socrates of all men least deserved, for it was on charge of impiety. Right, now this part of the story we know, right? But it's fascinating. First of all, you can see, again, if this is authentic, and even if it's not, right, you can see what somebody who's done a lot of reading of Plato sort of is taking from it, which is that the personal history, the formation of a young man, right, informs his political philosophy. And this is something that we all kind of know intuitively, but you don't really I think, assume it when you come to these great men of old. You sort of think they just sprung into being. But or rather Plato is saying, no, I had a genesis and a development too, right? I was born looking at things the way most people did, but then I had this, and this experience, and that taught me such and such a thing, right? And this is what he's saying in book 9 and 8 about the tyrannic and the timocratic and the oligarchic man. He's saying these people, they don't spring up from the ground. They come from somewhere. They are, they are influenced by the corruption that they witness around them, and they are in some cases corrupted by it. Or in the case of the writer of Epistle 7, right, they are actually taught to avoid corruption, right? So when I considered all this, says the author of the epistle, and the type of men who were administering the affairs of the state, with their laws too and their customs, the more I considered them, and the more I advanced in years myself, the more difficult appeared to me the task of managing the affairs of the state rightly. For it was impossible to take action without friends and trusty companions, and these it was not easy to find ready to hand, since our state was no longer managed according to the principles and institutions of our forefathers, while to acquire other new friends with any facility was a thing impossible. So he's explaining that this is the view I held when I came to Italy and Sicily at the time of my first arrival. When I came, I was in no wise pleased at all with the blissful life, as it was there termed, replete as it is with Italian and Syracusan banqueting. So here already tyranny, right, as a kind of overindulgence, slavery to desire. For thus one's existence is spent in gorging food twice a day and never sleeping alone at night, and all the practices which accompany this mode of living. For not a single man of all who live beneath the heavens could ever become wise if these were his practices from his youth, since none will be found to possess a nature so admirably compounded, nor would he ever be likely to become temperate. And the same may truly be said of all the other forms of virtue. So he's saying here, right, like you can't just be a brain in a jar. Like you actually come from somewhere. You're not immune to your environmental circumstances and environmental influence, even if you do have the capacity to, strive against it, right? So I traveled through to Syracuse, possibly as luck would have it, though it seems likely that one of the superior powers was contriving at that time to lay the foundation of the events which have now taken place in regard to Dion and in regard to Syracuse, and of still more events as it is to be feared, unless you now hearken to the counsel I offer you now for the second time. So he's saying my experience of tyranny, being like sold into slavery, attempting to speak truth to power, watching how oligarchs, right, sort of fell victim to their corruption, how even well-meaning overthrowers of oligarchs engaged in purges to sort of cement their power, and that killed Socrates, the greatest of men, right? This is what made me realize this is a really difficult problem, like how to run the state. And so, yeah, this is where Plato gets a lot of his insight into the tyrannical character. And so let me read to you now back to the Republic, right? His sort of description of the worst possible man. And it's beautiful in its humanity, the way that he has seen these guys who are supposedly the great men, right? The kings and princes of the earth, as the Bible would call them. That they're actually these, these sort of self-enslaved, tyrannical souls. So here's Socrates. He says, let us sum up the worst man. He is awake, presumably what we described a dreaming man to be. Now, remember, right, we read that the dreaming man is the one whose reason has shut down, whose thumos is only kind of half awake, and whose desires, even the like dark ones that he suppresses during the day, are all raging wildly. So he's saying the tyrant is awake, what we describe the dreaming man to be, just a tangle of desires ruling, right? And he comes from a man who is by nature most tyrannic and gets a monarchy. And the longer he lives in tyranny, the more he becomes like that, necessarily, Glaucon said, as he took over the argument. So Glaucon's coming back in on the picture after Adeimantus, right? He says, the man who turns out to be worst, I said, will he also turn out to be most wretched? And he who is for the longest time most a tyrant, will he also have been the most wretched for the longest time? In the light of the truth, there have been many opinions, but regardless, he said, this is necessarily so. With respect to likeness, I said, does the tyrannic man correspond to anything other than the city under a tyranny, and the man of the people to anything other than the city under a democracy? And similarly with the other men, of course not. And as a city is to city with respect to virtue and happiness, so is man to man. And this is where we get the idea that the worst possible thing to be is not just a tyrannical soul, but a tyrannical soul who actually gets power. Because, of course, there are tyrannized and tyrannical souls in every time and place, right? You and I have experienced some amount of tyranny of the soul. Hopefully not much. Hopefully we've striven against it, but everybody knows the experience of waking up and thinking, I drank too much last night. Or, God forbid, like I slept with the person I shouldn't have slept with, right? And that experience is the experience, that regret is the experience of being tyrannized in soul, right? By letting the parts of your soul that are not supposed to rule you. But he says this is, fine, this is bad enough, but the worst thing is to have that desire gratified, right? To just be given free rein. And this is why ultimately, right, the true the true victim of all moral injustice is the perpetrator of the moral injustice. Not to say that, bad people doing bad things does hurt the good people, right? But that's the idea here, is that moral corruption is itself the torment, the beginning of the hellish torment. And that's something that I think Milton dramatizes also in Satan, right? In a second, we're going to get into the Screwtape Letters and sort of satanic torment. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself again, because we're really talking about here is the nature, right, of tyranny of the soul, whether you have power or not. And if you gain power, all that happens is you become one man against an entire city, because you can't trust anybody because all your power is unjust. This is the Macbeth image, right? The guy holed up in the castle, getting more and more paranoid, and having to kill more and more people and defend himself against more and more potential usurpers, because the tyranny transformation is so complete, but it begins in the soul. So turn your phone off, right? Then seriously, like go to bed. Before you go to bed, like cultivate your own soul in this way, and you will have done a big part of your part, right, in preventing this sort of spirit from coming into being. All right, let's now, as we close out this book, let us talk about the nature of pleasure, because pleasure and desire, right, has been the kind of driving motor of this whole account of the state and of morality. So we now get some really, I think, excellent passages sort of to close out about the nature of pleasure. If you liked what you were able to do with Truebill, you're going to love what you can do with Rocket Money. So Truebill, as you will recall, is the service that helps you to cancel your unwanted subscriptions. People are always trying to rope you into stuff that you don't actually want by giving you a free trial and rolling you over into like a year-long subscription. Then you're paying for, I don't know, Hulu or the New York Times or, FaceApp or whatever. Truebill was the app that will help fix that. It remains the app that will help fix that, but it is now called Rocket Money, and they do all kinds of stuff. They've been getting bigger and bigger. They help over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more. Rocket Money is everything that I loved about Truebill, but with a fresh look and feel. They can help you get your finances in order, which is so important these days. It can be very difficult to make time for it, to prioritize it. Rocket Money makes it easy. Start canceling your unused subscriptions and save money at rocketmoney.com/heretics. That's rocketmoney.com/heretics to start canceling your unwanted subscriptions and getting your finances in order. So we've been working for 2 weeks, 2 books, right, on this notion of the different regimes corresponding to different kinds of souls. And I've been saying that a highest good is involved in each successive account. So your love is really the orientation of your soul, your eros, your desire that's pointing you towards some good. You may say you have one good, but act as if you have another, right? And the thing that wins out in those conflicts of good is the ruling part of you. And that's why it's also a political account, because the ruling part of the state, right, is also aiming toward a certain highest good. And so necessarily, right, when we say that we desire a good, it means that we have some desire which brings us pleasure. It may be that it also hurts us in all sorts of terrible ways if we've chosen the wrong highest good. But our pleasures are kind of our almost physical or our emotional experience of valuing something, of liking it or deriving pleasure from it. So, for instance, a way that you can make the distinction here, right, between the good and the pleasurable is you can say, well, like, let's say that I want to be fit, right? So I value physical fitness. But I also have experienced physical pain or lethargy, right? And so I don't actually go to the gym. Well, it's like, so I'm showing by my actions that the part of me that just wants physical pleasure, the physical appetitive part of me, has now ruled me, right, over my reason and my thumos for wanting to go to the gym. But the reason and the thumos also have a good, right? And if I let those goods rule me, then I will get another kind of pleasure. I'll get the satisfaction, right, of having gone to the gym and seeing changes in my body and feeling better. And the key insight here that Plato is about to unfold for us is that if I forego the good, the pleasure that is taking me away from the higher good and pleasure, I will eventually get that lower good thrown in and transformed. Because of course, when I stay at home, when I stay in bed, when I don't go to the gym, what do? I want to feel comfortable, right? I want to feel physically, I want to have good physical feelings. But The truth is, right, that I'm going to get momentary physical pleasure out of letting that part of my soul rule me. But if I let the thumos and the logos rule me and I go to the gym, I'm going to lose out on physical comfort for a bit. I'm going to feel discomfort. But then, right, as my body changes and as I get stronger, I'm actually going to be way more comfortable in my skin. I'm going to feel better. I'm going to look better. You're going to have better sex. Like you're going to be, you will be sort of standing standing taller and prouder, both physically and in the world. You'll have more comfort in yourself, and you'll be able to enjoy like food more, when you do eat. So all of this is by way of saying, right, you then get this kind of ennobled and transmogrified, redeemed version of the pleasure that you gave up to seek the higher good. And so this is what Plato is basically going to start arguing about: the aristocrat, the timocrat, the oligarch, and the tyrant, that each one of them seeks a certain kind of pleasure, right? And the aristocrat desires the pleasure of the good. The oligarch, the timocrat desires the pleasure of honor, which is the thumos pleasure, right, of being held to be noble. The oligarch desires the pleasure of just doing whatever you want with your money, right, having all this money and power. And the tyrant is kind of the extreme of that, the basest kind of pleasure. So each of those goods, right, comes along with a certain form of satisfaction. There's the satisfaction of getting whatever you want, right, even though eventually you become paranoid and afraid, you still have all the stuff that he was talking about in Syracuse, the feasts and the banquets and the orgies. But then, if you go up the ladder, well, you've got the oligarchic pleasure of having a lot of money, right? And sort of being very powerful and being able to do what you want when you want. A lot of times people are so jealous of that money that they never actually do it. They become miserly, but it's still, they feel like, oh, I could hire a yacht if I wanted to or whatever, right? So that's oligarchic pleasure, that feeling. And that sense of power. Then timocratic pleasure, I'm well regarded. That's almost a noble pleasure, right? I'm well regarded in my community. I'm loved, I'm liked. But the highest pleasure is, well, I'm loved and liked because I'm good, right? Or I'm not loved and liked, but I'm good, right? The thing that I long for is virtue and goodness. And so now what Plato is saying is that the reason we know those higher pleasures are nobler is because they actually contain the others. So listen to this passage. This is one of the best ones. He says, of the three men, the three kinds of pleasure seekers, of logos pleasure, thumos pleasure, and appetitive pleasure, right? Of these three men, which is most experienced in all the pleasures of which we were speaking? Does the lover of gain, because he learns the truth itself as it is, seem to you the more experienced in the pleasure that comes from knowing than the lover of wisdom is in the pleasure that comes from gaining? He's saying, if you desire wealth, right, do you have knowledge? And if you desire knowledge, do you have wealth? Which one is better to love? He says there's a great difference. It's necessary for the latter to taste of the other pleasures starting in childhood, but for the lover of gain, it's not necessary to taste or to have experience of how sweet is the pleasure of learning and the natural characteristics of the things which are, even if you were eager to, it wouldn't be easy. This is great. This is so smart. It's like you can say, of course, right, that the great sage has no knowledge of wealth because he lives on a mountaintop. But actually, he has plenty of knowledge of wealth. It's part of why he's on the mountaintop, right? He knows wealth more fully than the man who is a slave to wealth, and therefore he's forgone it, or he's chosen to only pursue moderate amounts, or he's chosen to bestow it well and to be charitable, right? And so actually, the person who knows knowledge and loves wisdom also knows wealth and knows the right amount of pleasure to get out of it by virtue of his wisdom. So we'll go on, right? So there's a great difference between the lover of wisdom and the lover of gain in their experience of both pleasures. So the lover of wisdom even loves his wealth more than the lover of wealth does, because he has the ability to be master of that love. And what about the lover of wisdom's relation to the lover of honor? Is he less experienced in the pleasure that comes from being honored than the lover of honor is in the pleasure that comes from thinking? No, he said, honor accompanies them all if each achieves his aim, for the wealthy man is honored by many, and so are the courageous man and the wise one. Therefore, all have experience of the kinds of pleasure that come from being honored. But the kind of pleasure connected with the vision of what is cannot be tasted by anyone except the lover of wisdom. Therefore, I said, as for experience, he is the finest judge among the three men. So he's saying, and this applies also to the lover of physical pleasures, right, that wisdom necessarily entails, right, knowledge of these things and the ability to put them in their proper place and therefore to enjoy them as fully as they can be enjoyed and know more fully. Whereas the lover of wealth or the lover of gain or sex or just, honor, never reaches that higher level at which he might be master over his own desires, and therefore is not able even to enjoy his wealth that much because he's always paranoid he's going to lose it or whatever. I'm going to read to you a passage now from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which is one of my favorite passages about this very subject. And it expresses it characteristically for Lewis, expresses it very well. He says, "No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. A silly idea is current that good people do not know what temptation means. This is an obvious lie. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of the German army by fighting against it, not by giving in. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like an hour later. That is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man who knows to the full what temptation means, the only complete realist." So the pleasure lover's pleasure is only a shadow of the pleasure that the wisdom lover takes, even in physical pleasure, right? This is why, when people have been talking about monkeypox lately, which is this disease that's affecting mostly gay and bisexual men who sleep in these vast orgies, right? It's not like you can get monkeypox by being in a monogamous gay relationship. And so people say, well, you're stigmatizing homosexuality. It's like, I'm not stigmatizing homosexuality. I'm stigmatizing sleeping with 15 partners in one night, or sleeping with anonymous people at all, or going to orgies, right? And it's like, yeah, that should have been stigmatized long ago, not because of monkeypox, not because you can get a disease from it, because the disease is only an outward consequence, right, of the reality of the thing, which is that it's debauched, it's debased. And so it's like, these pleasures which are so low, like I hear people talking now about their orgies that they went to when they got monkeypox, and it's like, you're not even having good sex. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure you're feeling a lot of physical pleasure, but like people who are in passionate marriages are like having really a lot of physical pleasure, but they're also coloring that physical pleasure with their relationship and their desire for one another and their respect for one another and their long-standing commitment to one another. And so they like don't feel all of the anxieties that are associated with infidelity. And like those things are actually much more pleasurable, right? And the physical pleasure is made more pleasurable by its being kind of ennobled. So again, like with the workout example, right? You've given up one pleasure, which is the orgy pleasure, sleeping with everything that moves. That's the tyrannical pleasure. That's being enslaved to your base physical desire so that you do things that degrade you. You give that pleasure up to be monogamous, right? And you therefore are not going to have as much, probably won't have as many orgasms, as many different kinds of orgasms, right? You also won't get monkeypox, but that's a side point, right? You won't have as many pleasures. You won't have as many orgasms. And so instead, right, you will pursue now a relationship with a human being as if that human being had a soul, and you will be faithful to that person because that's morally good, right? To make a promise and keep a promise is morally good. And suddenly you will realize gradually over time that the physical pleasure you gave up from the just wanting to be enslaved to pleasure has come back in redeemed form, in the form of sex within a monogamous, faithful relationship. And that sex is better because it is colored by the higher goods that you aimed at when you gave up the lower goods, right? You aimed at fidelity, you aimed at trust, you aimed at love, right? And by aiming at those things, you had to give up certain pleasures, which then now are redeemed and return all the better because they are shaped and guided and submitted to the higher rule of your logos, of your reason, and of your aiming for real love, right? And for real fidelity. And so this is why the one last passage I want to leave you with is actually not from Plato, but from the Screwtape Letters. And it's about God, the hedonist. And it sums up, I think, some of what we've been talking about. So this is Screwtape seething about God's hedonism. He says he's a hedonist at heart. All those fasts and vigils and stakes and crosses are only a facade, or only like foam on the seashore. Out at sea, out in his sea, there is pleasure and more pleasure. He makes no secret of it. At his right hand are, quote, pleasures forevermore. That's a quote from the Bible, right? Ugh, I don't think he has the least inkling of that high and austere mystery to which we rise in the miserific vision. He's vulgar wormwood. He has a bourgeois mind. He has filled his world full of pleasures. There are things for humans to do all day long without his minding in the least. Sleeping, washing, eating, drinking, making love, playing, praying, working. Everything has to be twisted before it's of any use to us. We fight under cruel disadvantages. Nothing is naturally on our side. Now, that is a magnificent dramatic articulation of what I've just been saying, right? Which is that the sea, the vigils are like the shore, foam on the seashore, that get us into the enormity of pleasures. He makes no secret of it. Pleasures forevermore, right? God, who is the truth, right, and who is love, is the highest good toward which ultimately all souls must orient themselves if they are to be free and not to be enslaved to the passions, to money, to honor, to all the things that Plato's been talking about, right? What's the one thing that will set you free, that will set you free for freedom? It's submission to God, right? Loving God and seeking God with your heart, mind, body, and all things, right? Which will involve giving up all sorts of stuff, right? I don't care what your situation is, you're going to give stuff up if you go for God, right? If you go for the highest good, if you go for love in itself, you're going to give up sex with a bunch of people, you're going to give up orgies, you're going to give up maybe a gluttony, you're going to give up alcoholism, you're going to give up any number of things, right? That's keeping you from the highest good of you. What's going to happen after that? You don't know, you can't see yet how that will be. But when that happens, when you do that, those pleasures will come back to you 1,000-fold, and they will be transfigured, right? Turned into what they truly are, which is the gifts of God, once you acknowledge that they are dependent upon him and therefore you are ready to sacrifice them for him. It's a beautiful insight which comes to us sort of by half measures, well, not by half measures, comes to us in a pagan form in Plato and in what I believe to be the full Christian form in the Bible and in the statement that you shall deny your life to save it, lose your life to save it, to follow me, right? That's what Jesus says. That's what he means. That's what this is about. Okay, folks, there's just, we're almost there. We've got one more book of the Republic, which we'll do next week. It's been a pleasure, as always, talking to you, especially with this series. I love the Republic series. I'm glad that you guys have been with me for it. And let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals. Head over there. If you're not already a VIP, please join us. We would love to have you in our community. It's a really, really cool, you would call it an online space if I were like a, campus lefty, right? It's a place where we gather together and we do live streams every Friday. It's like one of my favorite parts of the week. I answer people's questions about how to apply some of this wisdom to daily life. And, you get to be in the mailbag, which is an important benefit, of course. And you get also extra stuff like episodes a week in advance and essays that I write exclusively. But really, the best part about it is the relationship. It's about being in community with one another, talking about hard stuff, good stuff, easy stuff, difficult stuff, all on youngheretics.com/locals. So here is a mailbag question from Brand. I've wanted to ask a question for a while about telos. How do we know telos is fixed? For example, a frying pan's telos might be to cook food well, but if a robber breaks in your house and you use the frying pan to bonk the robber, is it then fulfilling its telos in that station? Is it then fulfilling its telos in that situation as a blunt object? Is telos not relative? Okay, this is great, and it does help to complicate what can become a kind of oversimplified idea about teleology. And this is an objection that's sometimes made against the whole notion of teleology. By people who either don't understand it or who have been dealing with an expositor of teleology that was not as careful a reader, especially of Aristotle, as possible. So the notion of telos, of your final cause or your goal, is intimately bound up with the second question, which is what is the thing, right? What is the thing and what is its purpose are like two halves, two questions on either side of the same coin. And your frying pan example is a perfect example of how one physical material object can be understood as two things, fittingly understood as two things. It is both a lump of matter and it is a tool that was designed with a purpose in mind, right? And this is, in Aristotle, this is usually expressed by the Greek preposition kata or katho, right? And that's what we would use in English is qua, right? If you think about, like, if I say, well, I am a man and qua man, right? I, want to be brave and strong, but qua human being, I am a rational animal, right? It means as, right? In my capacity as X or Y. And so we properly understand the nature of a thing, right? When we have understood its essential nature. So the frying pan, right, is a frying pan in essence because it is shaped to fry things. But because matter, right, is this kind of all-purpose substance, and because we live in a world where the forms are kind of shot through with matter, everything is also kind of something potentially understood as something else, right? What is the difference, the distinction? Well, the difference is consciousness, right? The ingredient that we haven't talked that much about in our discussion of telos is consciousness, because what's the part of your story, right, that's kind of in the background? So the robber comes in, now the frying pan has a goal, is being used for a purpose, a legitimate purpose, which is bonking the robber over the head. It wasn't made for that purpose, but my experience, my conscious awareness of the moral caliber of the situation turns it into a blunt object. And in that moment, I'm using it qua blunt object. And qua blunt object, it has the telos of being used to bonk over the head, right? The reason that it has a more essential telos as a frying pan is because there was also a consciousness that shaped it into a frying pan, right? A person chose to make it as a frying pan in the context of a social community, right? That has a need for frying pans and for frying things. So it's shaped, it's been made, right? Aristotle talks about this in his various forms of causes, right? The efficient cause, which is the art that makes the frying pan, that causes the matter to be shaped that way. The formal cause, right? Which is what is the best way for matter to be shaped in order to do the thing. And then the final cause, which is what's the thing that this consciousness is understanding the frying pan to do, to fry food. You, right, are also something who can be experienced and situated in all sorts of different ways, right? A person can be a flautist and a husband. And qua flautist, right, as flautist, by the essence of being a flautist is that he plays music, right? And so when you play music, you're fulfilling your telos as a flautist, because the answer to the question, what is a flautist, is answered by he plays the flute, right? That's the telos that kind of answers the what is question. Then there's as husband, right? What is a husband? Well, a husband is faithful to his wife. He bears children with her. He forms a family with her. He's a helpmeet. She's a helpmeet to him, and they sort of stand in one another's stead and so forth. And so, qua husband, that's your purpose, right? You have that purpose as a husband, and that telos as a husband. And all of this is because, right, as a being with a conscious, right, you can experience yourself in relation to others, and other people can experience you in relation to them, right, in different ways and in different relationships. The question then becomes, the frying pan has an essential telos, an essential nature, which is primary. Even when it is sometimes used rightly in other situations, right? And that's because it was made. It was created by somebody who had a purpose for it in mind, an ultimate purpose. Like it's shaped. You might say that the reason that telos is essential is because it's explanatory. It explains why the frying pan is shaped the way that it's shaped, right? And because it's explanatory, it has a certain essential nature that strikes at the heart of what the frying pan is, right? And so the question is, right, were you shaped? Because if you were shaped by a consciousness, then the thing that he shaped you to do, which is to love him and enjoy him continually, is the essential nature of you and of your final telos, because it has explanatory power about everything else about you, why you are shaped the way you are, why your body is shaped the way it is, why your passions point you in certain directions, why you happen to have this hobby and not another hobby, right? All of the way that you are shaped, right, then becomes a key to understanding your final telos that was imposed upon you, given to you by the consciousness that made you. And if no consciousness made you, then there is no final, ultimate, or essential telos, and you can be used and use yourself in all sorts of different ways, right? And that's the distinction. The distinction is conscious relationship. I hope that answers your question. It's a very important part of telos, which is something that often gets left out, and I haven't talked that much about it, so I'm glad for the opportunity. All right, folks, join us on Locals. Check out my book, How to Save the West, if you want to read more about telos. There's a whole chapter on the telos of the human in there. I think that's it for me. So if you like the show, check out the Claremont Institute where I work. It's the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind are two publications. I think there's a lot of great writing in there. You can find me there, but you can also find other very smart people smarter than me. And you can go to claremont.org/donate to help support us. Please don't forget to share the show, to rate it, to give us 5 stars. That bumps us up in the algorithm and spreads the word, spreads the message. And I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.